Welcome, everybody. Really delighted to have Cotter Christian with us for this faculty present session on ungrading. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Cotter.
Thanks, Rita. Yeah, I like these short sessions. I think that they have a lot of opportunity. So I'm glad to be sharing this research project that I've been working on for the last couple of years during the fall semester with a studio. Along with two graduate research assistants, one who's graduated, Samantha Tong, and another current student who you'll meet in just a moment. I have recordings of them. They're going to provide some insight and feedback as well. So we'll get right into it. So give me just 1 second while I share my appropriate screens. You're going to see Rita and my email for a minute. Okay, hopefully you're seeing the intro slide. Yes, toward an ungraded studio. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So the purpose of this project was really to look at how we can use self-assessment in an interior design studio, which could be applicable to other types of studios as well. And while it's not necessarily a fully ungraded studio, there were still grades at the end of the semester, it does kind of take a step towards what that might look like to remove grading from the studio as a whole. And I had help, as I said, from two graduate students, Samantha Tong in fall 2021 and Yoni Ramaka in this most recent fall 2022 semester. I was really inspired by this book called Ungraded, which came out, I believe, in December of 2020, and offers lots of great essays about grading and some of the drawbacks and benefits and challenges, and also some really specific strategies around how you can begin ungrading in your class as well. And then also I follow someone who wrote an essay in the book, Jesse Stommel, who is really active on the academic Twitter scene. And he has a lot to share about equity in grading. And I think it's particularly interesting where those things connect. And finally, I think students were really an inspiration for this project in general, because they have been, like all of us, having many challenges lately. And I also have seen struggling with engagement, and as well as lots of anxiety and mental health, and grades in and of themselves can contribute to those types of negative social consequences. So in this really super brief 20-minute or less presentation, I'm going to just kind of start with giving an introduction to ungrading, why I think it's promising, why now we can think about ungrading, provide just an overview of the project itself, and at the end, I'll invite Yoni and Sam to help share some of those findings. So in the spring semester, and by the way, I asked Yoni to help when he was helping put together some of the slides for this presentation. I'm like, can you find me a Scantron? And he had never heard of that before. So clearly there's some generational issues around grading too. So in the spring 2020 semester, everyone got either an A or an A minus. And I think I had some concerns over this initially, that would somehow compromise or challenge the work. But what I found in my classes was that work really didn't suffer. And the work that I saw across the interior design program was equally strong, despite the removal of the grade as a mechanism, as an extrinsic motivator. And I've always really used a lot of detailed rubrics in my teaching, which I find are quite time consuming and aren't always heard. So students kind of skip all of the detailed information and look just to the grade. So I don't know to what level all of that detail is always taken in. And finally, studio grading can really be biased. Whether we like it or not, we bring all of our own perspectives and ideas into the classroom, and it's hard to not come at our grades from a biased perspective, which oftentimes focuses on an end product and not necessarily on the process itself. And grades in and of themselves tend to advantage students who know how to get a good grade. So it advantages students who have historically had systemic privilege. According to Kahn and Bloom, grades discourage risk-taking. And in our research, we found this to be true as well. In addition, students often would cater their work once they knew how a faculty did grading, would often cater their work to that faculty instead of taking further risks on their own exploration. So we really wanted to know, are grades the best way to get students to experiment in a studio class? Or do they have some sort of perception of an achievable correctness in the studio? And also kind of critiquing this huge undertaking for faculty to make grading as nuanced as it's necessary to remove some of those biases. So what we did is we looked at what would be possible to get rid of grades as much as possible within a studio class. Obviously, we still had to give grades at the end of the semester. So how do we work within that framework? Students need those grades. They need them for scholarships, for their GPA, for grad school. This was an undergrad studio. And so what we did was we opted for a self-grading system where students would evaluate themselves at key points throughout the semester. And this intervention occurred in the fall 2021 and fall 2022 semesters. I used the Interior Design Studio 5 course, which is a class for students in the fall of their senior year. They sort of have one foot out the door as they're thinking about next steps, grad school, jobs, their capstone class. And it is a time that's really ripe for self-reflection, since this class is linked to professional practice and they're asking those questions about who they see themselves as a designer. The class itself looks at workplace design, or what it means to work and where that happens and how that happens. But the context is less important than the student experience. And so there were multiple assessment tools that we used in both semesters. Each semester, we started out with an anonymous pre-semester survey. There were focus groups at the start and the end of the semester. There were anonymous questions that were added to the end of term course evaluation. And then, of course, the self-assessments themselves were also an assessment tool for the larger project. And those are where they graded themselves. So the anonymous start of term survey, which was sent out before the class started, was really to get a sense of where student motivation comes from. We did that by asking what challenges that they had in their previous classes, how they see grades as an extrinsic motivation in studio, and also, like, what do they do when they get stuck? How do they move past those things? So it was really illuminating for a lot of those different reasons. And when we combined the results from both of those pre-semester surveys, what we found is that good grades were not necessarily a strong motivator in the studio class. What were inspiring settings and their inspiring peers were the primary motivator for many of the students. I would kind of hedge a little bit and say that this may be a hangover from online learning, when students necessarily weren't sharing the same space with each other. And so being back in person probably accentuated the way in which being around their peers was a motivator. Students were able to choose lots of different, they could choose as many as they wanted. What are the motivators that they find in a studio class? And you can see here that getting a good grade was chosen about half the time. However, when students were asked to rank those things, getting a good grade was never the number one selection. In fact, no students chose getting a good grade as their number one option. On the first day of class, and this is something I've been doing in classes for the last few years, I asked them to set goals for the studio, and those goals can be as broad as getting up earlier, getting to bed earlier, trying out more sketching as opposed to drawing in the computer. It's very personal. Those goals then become a mechanism for the self-assessment that the students later do. In other words, like, how are they making progress towards their goals is a way that the self-assessment becomes really personalized for each student. And this is an example of that midterm self-assessment, which was the primary method for self-grading. There are multiple questions on here about strengths and weaknesses, what they would have done differently in their work so far, what they've learned so far, how they feel about their participation. And then it ends with the Parsons grading standards, where they then select one of those grades based on that grading standard, and tell me why they think that that would be the grade that they deserve for that particular class. One question that I'm pretty consistent in asking is how often students talk about this class to other people not in the class, which I think shows a certain level of engagement and like where the class falls in the priority of their other studies. Once they submit these forms, we have a one-on-one meeting, both at midterm and at final. That's like 15 to 20 minutes where I talk about their responses on the form and give them another chance to sort of verbally articulate some of the things that they filled out on the form. I also reserve the right to change the grade if I think it's necessary. And there were really only 2 occasions where this happened. And in those 2 times, I ended up changing the grade upward because I felt like the students were maybe being a little too harsh on themselves, which we'll address a little bit later. There was also 2 additional questions that were added to the course evaluation. The fall 2022 course evaluations were not that successful because of the strike. I didn't have a lot of students filling those out. So this is just a sample from the fall 21 course evaluation. And this first question asked about motivation. Again, trying to look at and compare the responses at the beginning of the semester around motivation to the end of the semester after going through the self-grading process. And what we see is that grades still show up a couple of times as a motivator, although kind of hesitantly for one of the responses. But feedback, being around peers, and the portfolio all appear quite frequently as strong motivators for success in the studio. The other question asked about the self-grading process in general and those one-on-one meetings. And what I found is that the responses were consistently favorable. There was no negative reaction to the self-grading process or the one-on-one meetings. In fact, this student's response notes that they had a shift from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. The focus went from being on a grade to really focusing on what they learned, which I thought was particularly helpful in this context. By far, the most important aspect of the project were the focus groups, because this really gave us an insight into students' feelings around grades and how they sort of respond and think about grades in all of their classes. These focus groups were, I gave the grad students a kind of focus group cheat sheet that had a bunch of questions, but I also wanted them to feel like they could ask follow-ups and to really engage in a dialogue with the students. So the grad students led these. I never heard the responses or the recordings. So they anonymized the transcript and then they destroyed the recordings, which was in line with our IRB proposal. The focus groups were held once at the beginning and once at the end of each semester, and they were held during class in the last 45 minutes, and I made sure to leave the area so that they didn't see or know that I was anywhere near. So here are Sam and Yoni to introduce themselves real quick.
My name is Samantha Tong, and I am a graduate student of the MFA Interior Design program at Parsons.
And I'm Yoni, a double major at Parsons in interior design and lighting design.
So in this short clip, Sam's going to explain what some of the questions that we asked in those focus groups.
Some questions we asked in the focus groups were, what motivates you? What is your experience with grading? What do grades mean to you?
And again, as Sam mentioned, we asked a lot about where students find this motivation.
Students were saying that they found motivation in working together in the studio space, because when they were working from home, they felt a lack of motivation from not seeing each other create work. They also found motivation in planning for the future, in thinking about how good their work is and how that can get them to places in the future, such as grad school. They also found motivation and encouragement from professors, as well as themselves.
And one of the questions that we asked in those focus groups consistently was, what do grades mean to students?
When students were asked, what do grades mean to you? Many of them answered that it was a measure of how well they did, or it was a number to quantify how hard they studied. It was a means to getting into grad school or obtaining a scholarship. It was a proof of effort and it held them accountable. But only one mentioned that grades were helpful in improving their work.
So what were some of the issues that students had with grades?
Well, some of the drawbacks about grades or the grading system is that, and one thing that comes to mind is this like inconsistency between faculty of how, like, what do they judge as like an exceptional work from students, like an A. And one thing that makes a difference between studios and seminars is that in seminars, the students had a more clear rubric of grading, but in studio that was kind of like blurred. Another thing is that students would often tweak their work to make it fit to each and individual faculty's preference. And I remember one of the students saying that if you are scared during the grading to get a bad grade, then you're not going to push yourself, which was very interesting to hear about. And also, too often, the grading system in studio comes to the end of the process, which the students mentioned as not helpful at all. And I mean, do not promote risk-taking, demotivating students. Those are some of the challenges that we faced.
So we wanted to know, based on those challenges, what are some of the ways that they thought they could improve grading?
The way to improve the grading, students mentioned that providing more checkpoints throughout the semester was one of them. Having clearer rubrics, because there were courses that didn't have a rubric at all. But the number one was the desire of students to have more interactions, or like one-on-one interactions with instructor. That was a very top one that all of them mentioned. And like exit tickets or midterm feedback. Yeah, those were the things that the students were more passionate about.
At the end of the semester focus groups, we had the students reflect upon the self-grading process itself, and here are some of those responses.
In general, students found that the self-assessment format was a fair way to grade themselves. They mentioned that it felt more process-based rather than end result-oriented, and they appreciated the agency to self-grade because they could reflect on themselves and the work they have done. In fact, a student actually said, I think that the self-grading system itself is motivating because you can just sit there and do nothing and give yourself an A.
Yeah, and I remember students saying that they wished that they had this sort of method of self-evaluating spread across more courses. And one of them also mentioned that you can actually tell how the professor cares about you when you have this conversation and you have it more spread throughout the semester.
Sorry about the meeting notification. I finally asked Sam and Yoni to share just some of their personal takeaways from the focus groups.
Overall, the biggest takeaways from the focus groups were that grades do not appear to be a big motivator of success in a studio course, that grades are seen primarily as an administrative mechanism that allows you to get into grad school or get a scholarship, that students are motivated by seeing each other's work and being with each other in the process of making work, that grading in the studio is inherently subjective because you can quantify something that is a creative product. And lastly, the fear of not getting a good grade discouraged students from taking risks.
Yeah, and for me, my biggest takeaways were that self-assessment empowered students to take agency over their own success and failures, and also encouraged them to have more one-on-one interactions with the faculty, or like provide more feedback, or de-emphasized the final project outcomes and, you know, highlighted more of like a progress or like a process-based evaluation.
And so the self-grading, as we learned, was both pretty effective and well received by the students. I find that their work was creative, experimental, and in some ways, more so than in other studios, I found that the students took more liberties with their projects to focus on aspects sparked by their own curiosity. So if there was something that they really wanted to get to know, they allowed themselves the freedom to kind of go down those rabbit holes, which for me, I think is important in these types of classes. It also encourages a culture of self-reflection and metacognition, understanding how they learn and why they're learning. However, some of the drawbacks are that filling out those forms are kind of time consuming, both for them and for me to read. There is this idea that students might take advantage of self-grading, yet I only really had one experience of that. And that student actually ended up dropping the class for other reasons. So that didn't really come up. I think part of that is the type of trust and community that you create within the class dynamic is really important. But the bigger problem is that students grade themselves lower. So students don't see themselves as competent. They may suffer from imposter syndrome. And also, it's new to students. They're used to being graded. And so you kind of have to teach them and help them throughout to understand what it means to do self-grading. So that's what we found the last 2 semesters doing this project. And, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, I think it was Mariah Doran who told me one time when I was doing another project similar to this in terms of assessing classroom behavior, anytime you pay attention to students, you're going to have a good outcome. And that was certainly what I found here.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Cotter.
Yeah, of course.
We have some time for Q&A. Please feel free to unmute yourself. David.
Thanks, Cotter. It's great to hear the presentation, and I especially appreciate the motivation, which is if grades aren't the answer, the role of education is fundamentally to inspire, to transform, to allow the students to be able to engage in a manner that encourages and in fact complements risk-taking, which often the grades are not. And I think that's one of the really key takeaways. I'll also note that, and there's a kind of interesting parallel thing happening. We're looking at awards for graduating students that have just come in. I'd look through all of the summary grades. One student in the entire grading Parsons, all graduate students combined, doesn't have above a 3.0. One. In all graduating students. So if you look at it from a grading standpoint, the average of SCE is 3.7. You know, you could do averages in others at 3.9. You know, why are we giving grades at a graduate level? You know, I don't have this is actually a graduate, and well, this is graduate. I haven't done a deep dive into the undergraduate, but I suspect it's similar. So part of it is, what are the hindrances legally to moving to a full grading process, full non-grading, or pass-fail, or something else that can allow the focus and innovation that you brought to not just be a kind of stopgap, or, you know, because you had to qualify it by these kind of constraints of federal rules. And what are the ways in which one could move more fully to a kind of embrace of this? So it's not a pilot, but actually a pilot in service of a broader framework. Because the research, the evidence we have is grades just not really doing the distinctions that they were originally historically set out to do. Everyone gets an A.
Right. And where we see the disputes is between a B+ and an A-, right? Like it's become so nuanced that it's lost its meaning, or the meaning's just shifted to these really small marginal differences. Yeah. I think looking into and better understanding what the challenges are. And I think for undergrads, it's much more difficult because grad schools still ask for GPA.
Are they?
Oh, hi. great presentation, very eye-opening. It's great to kind of get into the weeds. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it was great to get into the weeds and really understand the process. Actually, the question I have is kind of the counter that this could be a great idea, but it's almost like you now have to train the faculty and grade them on their ability to do ungrading, because this seems like it's your level of understanding is so great, and the nuances you are able to kind of get involved with, and the subtleties of accommodating certain awkward situations is the question. Do you see this as something that could be rolled out to general faculty? I mean, yes, long term, after David's question, but do you see that as a problem, and there being an inconsistency as a result of faculty resistance and inability to kind of get,
Yeah, resistance is probably a huge one, because I think that from a standpoint of traditional way we think about power dynamics in a classroom, grades are something that feels comfortable and familiar. And so that's kind of an issue. But as far as rolling out something similar, at least having these conversations among faculty, I think we can't necessarily be doing any harm by talking about new ways of thinking about assessment. Any more harm than from what we heard in the focus groups about studios and other classes not even having rubrics or any other metric by which they're evaluating student work. So I think we're already not doing the thing that we should be doing, which is talking about effective, fair, and equitable grading. And so if having a conversation around ungraded or self-grading practices is a way to start having that conversation, then it's worth the challenge, because right now there's already so much inconsistency that I can't imagine we would necessarily be introducing any more. At least we would be opening it up for others to have their own thoughts and feedback as well.
I will say that I'm hearing this coming up more and more. Lang first year in their first year writing program is experimenting with ungrading. I keep trying to remember Michelle Gorman collaborated and actually got approval from the provost's office to be able to experiment with ungrading. So yeah, I think these conversations, to David's point, I would love to know what are we absolutely required to do, and what would it take to move institutionally into this direction, because clearly there is so much benefit for the students and the faculty.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
Well, I have one question, if I'm not, Allison, were you about to say something? Just in response to that and David's question, part of what you said was that you kind of had override power to change grades at the end. It seems to me that maybe an answer is to separate the role of grades from the role of learning in the student's mind, which is what it seems you've done to some extent there. So whether during a certain crossover phase, we are still able to provide grades to institutions or to the greater powers, but still in the students' minds, get them to take on this notion of self-assessment as the way of learning, as opposed to the grade. That seems like something very promising already, as a possible direction forward.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, no, I think self-reflection, self-assessment, all that stuff is really, but it has to be, I think I've done it in the past where there's not a closing of the loop. I think that's the part that's really important, is that once the students engage in some sort of reflective activity, that they're able to then talk to the instructor about what that meant. So often they'll do some kind of reflection and it kind of lives in their own world of a journal or Canvas or whatever it is. I think it's that one-on-one meeting, it's that interaction with the self-reflection that's really important and powerful. The other thing that you mentioned about my ability to override, that feels icky to me still. And I think it's still like holding on to some semblance of control that's just hard to let go of. On the flip side, it did make students feel a little more comfortable. So that's another thing to interrogate a little bit as well.
You know, as you were saying that, I could imagine that the principle would be, I reserve the right to increase your grade,
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
but I don't have the right to decrease it. To get at the person like me who would grade myself probably more harshly than you would.
Yeah. And Boyega, I saw a presentation of someone who was using goal setting in the class, and that was the only thing the student was graded on. So it was a studio class, and they had to set some kind of goal, like maybe it was, I want to start working more analog, I want to make more, whatever it is, right? That was the only thing that the faculty graded them on, was whatever they set as their goal. So then it took pressure off of all the other things. It was an interesting approach, and I have their email, so I'm going to reach out to them at the University of Utah or something like this, because I want to find out a little bit more about that process, because it kind of does a little bit what you're talking about, like decoupling and giving them agency over what they want to focus on in that particular class as well.
Boyega, I apologize for misremembering your name. Cotter, would you be able to share PDF versions of the self-reflections and self-assessments? That would be fantastic,
Sure.
so that we can make that available for those who watch the presentation.
Will do.
Thank you so much for doing this. This was really, really informative and helpful.
Yeah, thanks
Thanks
for having me.
Thanks everyone for joining us.